My name is Dr. Amelia Grant, and at 36 years old, I was standing on the stage of my hospital's most prestigious charity gala. It was the greatest night of my career. That is when my father collapsed into a coughing fit in the front row, and my mother shouted for hundreds of our city's elite to hear Amelia. How can you ignore your own dying father? Their public ambush was a lie. A cruel performance designed to force me to sell my $1.2 million home for my sister's divorce. They expected tears. They got silence. They forgot that a surgeon's hands are steadiest when the stakes are highest. And this operation I had been planning for 10 years. The warmth of the spotlight felt like validation, a physical manifestation of a decade of relentless work. Below me, the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel held the city's most influential people, their faces turned upward as I spoke. The teleprompter displayed the numbers we had achieved for the hospital's new oncology wing figures that represented lives we could save. My voice was steady, filled with a pride I had earned one grueling surgery at a time. I was in my element, in control. Then a sound pierced the focused silence. A cough. It was a hacking theatrical sound that was impossible to ignore. My eyes darted to the front table, the one reserved for my family. My father Arthur was slumped in his chair, his face pale under the soft lighting, his hand clutching his chest. A ripple of concern went through the audience. My mother Helen was instantly by his side, but not with the quiet efficiency of a worried wife. Her movements were large, her expression a mask of public anguish. Before I could process what was happening, my sister Tiffany shot up from her seat. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a practiced terror, and then turned to the table next to them where the hospital's largest donor was seated. I saw her mouth the words, "He is not well." The teleprompter continued to scroll, but the words blurred into meaningless shapes. The carefully constructed atmosphere of hope and achievement shattered. The microphone in my hand suddenly felt heavy, an indictment rather than an instrument. The room was no longer filled with supporters, but with spectators at a family drama. The subtle shift was palpable, a chilling wave of whispers and uncomfortable glances. My brain, trained for crisis, sorted the facts with a cold, detached clarity. My father's last physical was 3 weeks ago. His results were perfect. This was not a medical emergency. It was an ambush. I took a breath, my gaze sweeping over the crowd and landing back on my family. They were the center of attention now, a tableau of suffering and concern. My mother was dabbing my father's brow with a napkin while Tiffany held his other hand, weeping softly. They had stolen my moment, my night, and were attempting to steal my reputation with it. My speech had 5 more minutes. I delivered the last lines from memory, my voice a fraction tighter, but unwavering. I thanked the donors, outlined the next steps for the wing, and ended with a call to action that felt hollow even to my own ears. The applause that followed was scattered, polite. It was the sound of a room wanting desperately to be anywhere else. As I stepped down from the stage, the hospital's board president, Mr. Davenport, intercepted me. His smile was strained. "Amelia, a wonderful speech. I do hope your father is all right." His tone held a professional distance that had not been there an hour before. The damage was already done. Across the room, I watched as several guests patted my mother's shoulder, offering condolences for a tragedy that did not exist. I was no longer the brilliant surgeon leading a vital cause. I was the neglectful daughter. The drive from the city to my house on Lake Michigan was a 90-minute blur of headlights and silence. The car's interior was a vacuum, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the gala, but my mind was anything but quiet. I replayed the scene on a loop, the feigned cough, my mother's performance, the calculated destruction of my credibility. Each replay chipped away at the shock, replacing it with a cold, familiar resolve. By the time I turned onto the long wooded driveway, the numbness had receded, leaving behind the hard edge of anger. I built this house, not with my own hands, but with every extra shift, every holiday spent on call, every personal want I had deferred for years. The clean lines of the architecture and the wide glass walls facing the water were a testament to my discipline. It was more than a home. It was my sanctuary, the one place on earth where I was not the responsible older sister or the on-call surgeon, but simply Amelia. As I stepped inside, the stillness of the place settled over me, and in the quiet, a memory surfaced sharp and unwelcome. It was 10 years ago. A different crisis, a different panicked phone call in the middle of the night. It was Tiffany, her voice thin and frantic from a hotel room in Las Vegas. She had gotten in over her head with the wrong people. She owed $80,000 and they wanted it by sunrise. I remember the exhaustion that hit me, a fatigue that went bone deep. I had just finished saving for a down payment on this very piece of land. Without a second thought, I wired the money, every last cent. Tiffany came home full of promises she would never keep. She would pay me back, she would get help, she would change. She did none of those things. But that night, I did something that would change everything for me. 2 weeks later, I sat in a lawyer's office, the wire transfer receipt on the table between us. I told him I needed to protect my future from my family's present. That was the day the Grant Family Irrevocable Trust was born. It was not a tool to control them, but a shield to protect myself. I placed this house, my investments, and my future earnings into it. My parents and Tiffany were named as beneficiaries, but only upon my death. My lawyer called it standard estate planning, but I insisted on one addition, a clause he had never seen before. He called it a character clause. It was a fail-safe, a final line of defense. The clause stated that the beneficiary rights of any family member would be permanently and immediately terminated if they were found to have committed a criminal act or a malicious act of public defamation intended to harm the creator of the trust. Now, standing in my living room, I looked out at the dark, placid water of the lake. The peace I felt in this house was not an accident. It was a deliberate, legally fortified construction. My family's performance at the gala was not just an emotional attack. It was a malicious act of public defamation. They thought they were laying siege to my home. They had no idea they were about to trigger the self-destruct sequence on their own inheritance. Returning to the hospital on Monday morning was like walking into a different world. The usual morning greetings were replaced with averted eyes and hushed conversations that abruptly stopped when I approached. The air, normally buzzing with professional energy, was thick with gossip. I was no longer Dr. Grant, head of surgery. I was a tabloid headline, a subject of pity and speculation. I ignored it, focusing on my morning rounds with a rigid professionalism that left no room for questions. My first surgery of the day was a complex aortic valve replacement. As I scrubbed in, the familiar ritual calmed my nerves. In the operating room, there was no room for family drama. There was only the patient, the procedure, and the unwavering focus it demanded. For 6 hours, I was exactly where I needed to be in a world governed by precision skill and absolute control. After the successful surgery, I returned to my office, the sterile scent of the OR still clinging to my scrubs. An email was waiting in my inbox. The subject line was blank. The sender was David Chin, a junior accountant who served on the hospital's charitable foundation board with me. David was quiet, meticulous, and one of the most ethically grounded people I knew. The body of the email contained only a single sentence. Dr. Grant, we need to talk. Absolutely confidential. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I replied with just 2 words. My office. 10 minutes later, he slipped through my door, closing it softly behind him. He looked nervous, clutching a tablet to his chest like a shield. He did not waste time with small talk. Doctor, I know about what happened at the gala, and I think it might be connected to something I found in the foundation's accounts. His voice was low, almost a whisper. He handed me the tablet. On the screen was a spreadsheet, rows and rows of numbers. He had highlighted 3 transactions. They were large withdrawals categorized under vague headings like donor outreach consulting and event logistics services. The recipient for all 3 payments was a company I had never heard of, Lakeside Strategic Solutions. The payments totaled over $200,000 in the last 6 months. David had already done some digging. The registered agent for Lakeside Strategic Solutions was my father, Arthur Grant. The air left my lungs. The foundation was the heart of my professional life, a legacy I was building to outlast my career. My parents were on the board, an honorary position I had arranged for them, a way to include them in my world. I had given them access, trusted them, and they had used that trust to siphon money from a fund meant to save cancer patients. David's voice broke through the haze of my shock. "The annual audit is in 6 weeks," he said. "They are going to find this. If they need a large sum of money fast, maybe they thought—" He did not need to finish the sentence. The performance at the gala, the public humiliation, the pressure to sell my house, it all snapped into a horrifyingly clear picture. This was not about Tiffany's divorce. It was never about my father's health. It was about covering up a crime. They were not just trying to take my home. They were trying to make me pay for their felony. The information David had given me settled in my chest like a block of ice. Felony. The word echoed in the sterile silence of my office. It recontextualized everything. The public spectacle at the gala was not a desperate plea for help. It was the frantic act of criminals trying to force their getaway driver. I spent the next hour in a state of controlled shock, pulling up the foundation's public filings, cross-referencing dates, and creating a secure digital folder for everything David had shown me. My mind, trained to diagnose and plan, shifted from familial betrayal to clinical damage control. Then, the storm began. My phone, sitting on the corner of my desk, began to vibrate violently. My mother's name lit up the screen. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the answer button, but I stopped. Answering would be a mistake. Engaging with their hysteria was their goal. My silence was my only weapon. I let it go to voicemail. Less than a minute later, it buzzed again. Tiffany. I silenced the ringer, but the screen continued to flash, a relentless beacon of their escalating panic. The calls came one after another, a coordinated assault. My mother, then Tiffany, then my father. They cycled through their designated roles with a nauseating predictability. The voicemails they left were a masterclass in manipulation. My mother's voice was a shrill wave of accusation, insisting my father was fading fast, that my coldness was literally killing him. Tiffany's was a tearful, whining diatribe about how I had always been selfish, how I owed her this one thing after a lifetime of her having to live in my shadow. My father's message was perhaps the most chilling. It was calm, measured, and dripping with disappointment. He spoke of family duty, of the sacrifices they had made for me, and how my refusal to help was a stain on the family's honor. The calls continued throughout the day. They interrupted my consultations with patients. They buzzed in my pocket during a department meeting. They tried my office landline, forcing my assistant to run interference. Each unanswered call seemed to fuel their frenzy. By the time I left the hospital that evening, my call log was a long, unbroken list of their names. 27 missed calls. Driving home, I did not feel weak or scared. I felt a surgeon's clarity. I was no longer dealing with a dysfunctional family. I was dealing with a malignant tumor, and you do not reason with a tumor. You excise it, cleanly, completely. When I got home, I poured a glass of water and sat at my kitchen island. I took a deep breath, and on the next incoming call from my mother, I answered, but I did not speak. I simply pressed the record button on a secondary device, letting the audio capture her torrent of guilt and fabricated panic. I did the same for my father's call a few minutes later. I was no longer a daughter weathering a storm. I was a clinician gathering data, documenting the pathology of their lies for the procedure to come. The calculated silence I had imposed seemed to work at least for a few days. The barrage of calls slowed to a trickle, then stopped completely. A fragile, unnerving peace settled over my life. I went to work, performed my surgeries, and tried to rebuild the professional normalcy my family had shattered. I almost allowed myself to believe they had given up, that the sheer audacity of their plan had collapsed under its own weight. It was a foolish hope. The doorbell rang on a Saturday afternoon, a sharp, intrusive sound that was rare in my quiet neighborhood. Through the security camera on my phone, I saw a man in a courier's uniform standing on my porch. He was holding a large, stiff manila envelope. My stomach tightened. I knew with a certainty that was both psychic and logical that this was the next stage of their attack. I accepted the package, my hands steady as I signed the digital scanner. The envelope was heavy official. Inside, a thick stack of papers was held together by a large clip. The cover sheet was stark printed with the seal of the Cook County Circuit Court. My own name was listed as the defendant. My parents, Arthur and Helen Grant, were the plaintiffs. I walked to my kitchen island, the same spot where I had recorded their frantic calls just days before, and began to read. The legal language was dense, but the core of their claim was brutally simple. They were suing me. They were petitioning the court to declare my father medically incapacitated and to appoint my mother as his guardian. As part of that guardianship, they were asking the judge to order the liquidation of assets deemed necessary for his care, starting with the house held in the family trust, my house. They had twisted the narrative of the gala into a weapon. The legal filing was filled with sworn affidavits from distant relatives and family friends, people who had been at the gala or had been fed my parents' version of the story. They described me as a cold, career-obsessed daughter who was callously withholding resources from her ailing father. They painted a picture of a man in rapid decline and of a family desperate to provide him with experimental treatments that his heartless daughter refused to fund. It was a work of fiction, a meticulously crafted lie designed to play on the sympathies of a judge. They had taken their public performance and codified it into a legal document. The absurdity of it was breathtaking. They were suing the head of surgery at one of Chicago's top hospitals for medical neglect. The very accusation was an attack on my professional identity, a calculated blow designed to inflict maximum damage. I read through the pages again, a cold fury building inside me. They were no longer just trying to pressure me or manipulate me. They had crossed a line. They had weaponized the legal system using the courts to try and accomplish what their emotional blackmail could not. They had made this a formal public war. Their names printed in the stark black ink of the court filing looked alien to me. These were not my parents. They were adversaries, and they had just made the gravest miscalculation of their lives. News of the lawsuit spread like a virus. My parents, it seemed, had no intention of keeping this a private matter. They wanted a public trial, not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. And they were winning. The first calls came from my extended family. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, was the first. Her voice was thick with disappointment. "Amelia, I never thought you could be so cruel. Your father has always been so proud of you." I tried to explain, to tell her about the lies, the embezzlement, but she cut me off. "Your mother is a mess. You need to do the right thing." It was clear she had been given her script. One by one, the pillars of my childhood support system crumbled. Uncles, cousins, people who had sent me birthday cards and attended my medical school graduation now spoke to me with a coldness that was more painful than any shouted accusation. They had heard only one side of the story, a carefully curated narrative of a suffering father and a selfish daughter, and they had believed it without question. The isolation became most acute at work. The gossip had now been supercharged with the fuel of a public lawsuit. My colleagues were professionals. No one mentioned it directly to my face. But the silence in the doctor's lounge when I walked in was deafening. Lunch invitations became less frequent. I saw the pity in the eyes of the nurses, the careful neutrality in the faces of my fellow surgeons. They did not know the details, but the optics were terrible. A successful doctor being sued by her own family for neglect. It was a stain that was hard to ignore. I found myself retreating, eating lunch alone in my office, burying myself in patient charts and surgical reports. The hospital, once my sanctuary of order and purpose, now felt like a minefield of judgment. Every hallway conversation I passed felt like it was about me. Every quiet look felt like an indictment. The worst part was the insidious creep of self-doubt. Late at night, alone in my house, the quiet would amplify the accusations. Was I being too harsh? Was there some other way to handle this? The lifetime of conditioning to be the responsible one, the peacemaker fought against the surgeon's instinct to cut out the disease. My family knew exactly which buttons to push, and even in their absence, their voices echoed in my head. I remember standing in my kitchen one evening, staring out at the lake as the sun set, the lawsuit papers spread out on the counter. The weight of it all felt immense. I was an island cut off from my family, my community, and my professional support system. They had successfully isolated me, surrounding my fortress with a wall of silence and disapproval. They believed they had pushed me to the edge of surrender, and for a fleeting moment, exhausted and utterly alone, I almost considered it. The breaking point did not come with a shout or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived silently in the form of an email on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in a quarterly budget meeting with the hospital board presenting a revised forecast for the oncology wing. I had spent the entire weekend preparing, determined to show that despite the personal chaos swirling around me, my professional commitment was unshakable. I was holding my own, answering tough questions with data and composure. Then my phone, sitting face down on the polished mahogany table, buzzed with a notification. It was from Mr. Davenport, the board president, who was sitting directly across from me. He gave me a brief, almost imperceptible nod. The email was for the entire board. Its subject line was blunt, update, regarding the Sterling Foundation pledge. The Sterling Foundation was our cornerstone donor, a pillar of Chicago philanthropy. Their patriarch, a man I had personally guided through a difficult surgery years ago, had pledged $500,000 to the wing at the gala. It was the largest single contribution. My hands felt cold as I opened the email. The language was polite corporate and utterly devastating. It stated that due to recent events that raised concerns about the Foundation's internal stability and leadership, the Sterling Foundation was respectfully withdrawing their pledge, effective immediately. They wished the hospital the best in its future endeavors. $500,000. Gone. Not because of budget deficits or competing projects, but because of a lie my parents had started. The number hung in the airless room, a symbol of the collateral damage they were inflicting. This was not just about my house anymore. This was not just about my feelings or my reputation. This was about a state-of-the-art facility that would not be built as quickly. It was about patients who would have to wait longer for treatment. It was about the legacy I was trying to build, a legacy of healing being dismantled piece by piece by the people who should have been its proudest champions. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The exhaustion and the self-doubt of the past week burned away, replaced by a pure, unadulterated rage. It was the focused anger of a surgeon who sees a healthy organ being threatened by a relentless cancer. My family had breached the walls of my personal life and were now attacking my work, my purpose. They had made a fatal, unforgivable error in judgment. They thought they were targeting my wealth. But they had just attacked the one thing I valued more than anything: my ability to care for others. I looked up from my phone and met Mr. Davenport's gaze across the table. My voice when I spoke was devoid of emotion. It was the calm, steady voice I used in the operating room right before the first incision. "Please excuse me. I have to make a call." I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the room. The discussion about my family was over. The war had just begun. I did not go back to my office. I did not go home. I walked out of the hospital, the cold afternoon air a sharp contrast to the heated fury inside me, and got into my car. I drove downtown, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. There was only one destination in my mind: the office of Catherine Rios. Catherine was not just a lawyer. She was a legend in Chicago's legal circles. She was the attorney you hired when you did not just want to win, you wanted to leave a crater where your opponent used to stand. Her firm occupied the top floor of a skyscraper, a minimalist space of glass and steel that offered a commanding view of the city. Catherine herself was just as sharp and unadorned, a woman in her 50s with an unnervingly calm demeanor and eyes that missed nothing. I had placed the lawsuit papers, the flash drive with the recorded phone calls, and the secure folder of David's financial findings on her conference table. She reviewed them in silence for 20 minutes, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, a small, dangerous smile touched her lips. "Well, Dr. Grant," she said, her voice a low, precise instrument, "this is not a lawsuit. It is a declaration of war. And they have come to the battlefield woefully unprepared. I have spent my entire life on the defensive with them." I replied, my own voice tight with a lifetime of suppressed frustration. "That ends today. I want to attack. I want to dismantle every lie, and I want to do it with overwhelming force." Catherine leaned forward, her focus absolute. "Good. Then this is what we do. Tell me your objectives." "First," I said, leaning forward to mirror her intensity, "the lawsuit. I want it gone. That is the easy part." She waved a dismissive hand. "Their claim is based on a fraudulent medical premise, which brings me to my first action item for you. I need your authorization to subpoena your father's complete medical records for the last 10 years from every physician and institution he has visited. We will bury them in medical facts." "Done," I said without hesitation. "Second, the money, the embezzlement from the foundation. This is where we move from defense to offense." Catherine's eyes gleamed with strategic light. "This is the felony. I will engage a forensic accounting firm that specializes in nonprofit fraud. We will conduct a full independent audit. We need to know exactly how much they took where it went and how they covered their tracks." I nodded, a sense of empowerment surging through me for the first time in weeks. I signed the retainer and the authorization documents without hesitation. The crisp sound of the pen on the thick paper was the sound of a decision being made, a line being irrevocably crossed. As I left her office, Catherine walked me to the door. "Get some rest, doctor," she said. "The next few weeks are going to be difficult, but I promise you by the time we are done, they will regret ever underestimating you." Driving away from her building, I felt a calm I had not experienced since the night of the gala. The fear and isolation had been replaced by a cold, clear purpose. The board was no longer theirs to control. I was taking every piece off one by one until only the truth remained. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet, methodical warfare. While my family likely assumed I was reeling from their lawsuit, I was operating with the detached precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. I went to work, I performed my duties, and I waited for Catherine's team to gather the ammunition we would need. The first report arrived via a secure digital courier from Catherine's office. It was my father's complete medical history for the past decade. I read through the clinical notes, the lab results, the imaging reports, my own professional training, allowing me to see past the jargon to the simple, undeniable truth. There it was dated 5 years prior, a record of a minor outpatient procedure to remove a benign cyst from his lung. The pathology report was unequivocal. Benign, harmless. The final page was an insurance summary showing the entire procedure from consultation to follow-up had been covered 100%. The so-called life-threatening illness that formed the entire basis of their lawsuit was a ghost, a fiction built on a minor, long-resolved medical issue. I saved the file, labeling it Exhibit A. The second report arrived 2 weeks later. This one was not a slim medical file, but a thick, spiral-bound volume from the forensic accounting firm. It was a dense, meticulously detailed autopsy of the charity foundation's finances. Page after page laid out a complex web of shell corporations, inflated invoices, and phantom consulting fees. They had been systematic siphoning off small amounts over years to avoid detection. The accountants had traced every diverted dollar. The final tally was printed on the last page, a number that seemed to burn on the paper: $850,000. And at the bottom of the report was the linchpin, the connection that turned suspicion into fact. The sole signatory on the bank accounts for every single shell corporation was my father, Arthur Grant. I placed the two reports side by side on my dining room table. One was a lie about his health, a betrayal of me as a daughter. The other was a lie about his integrity, a betrayal of my life's work. Together, they formed a complete, irrefutable picture of greed and deception. They were not just desperate parents. They were calculated criminals. I picked up my phone and called Catherine. I did not waste time with pleasantries. "Catherine," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I have everything. I can hear it in your voice," she replied. "The reports are as damning as we hoped." "More," I said. "They are conclusive. I want to schedule the meeting." Her silence on the other end was brief but charged with understanding. A formal deposition, a settlement conference. "No," I said, "not a legal proceeding. Not yet." They wanted a family meeting to discuss my father's urgent medical needs and my financial responsibilities. I think it is time we granted their request. Let us invite them to your office to have that very conversation. They arrived at Catherine's office looking every bit the part they had cast for themselves. My father walked slowly, leaning on my mother's arm with a practiced frailty. My mother's face was a mask of weary concern, and Tiffany followed behind them, her expression a blend of sorrow and righteous indignation. They were dressed for a funeral in somber tones of gray and black. They surveyed the cold modern conference room with disapproval, as if its lack of sentimentality was a personal affront. I was already seated at the head of the long glass table with Catherine to my right. I said nothing as they entered, simply watching them take their seats opposite us. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. My father began, his voice weak but firm. "Amelia, I am glad you finally agreed to this. We do not want to be in this position. We are your family. All we are asking for is your help." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I replied. My voice was even clinical. "I agree we do need to discuss your health. In fact, I have taken the liberty of gathering all the relevant information to ensure we have a productive conversation." I slid a single slim folder across the table. My father eyed it with suspicion before opening it. Inside was the complete medical report, the one I had labeled Exhibit A. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I saw the flicker of confusion, then the dawning horror, as he realized what he was reading. My mother leaned over, her brow furrowed, and I saw her mouth the word benign. Tiffany, ever the impatient one, snatched the papers from her father's hand. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "That I said leaning forward slightly is your father's complete medical history for the past 10 years. It shows quite clearly that he is in excellent health. It also details the minor procedure he had 5 years ago to remove a harmless cyst, the one you have been describing to the courts and to our entire community as a life-threatening illness." The silence that followed was absolute. The color drained from my mother's face. My father seemed to shrink in his chair, the facade of his illness crumbling away in an instant. Tiffany stared at the papers, her mouth slightly agape, as if the words themselves were a betrayal. The first pillar of their elaborate lie had just been reduced to dust. They looked up at me, their eyes filled not with remorse, but with the panicked confusion of liars who had just been caught. And they knew with a dawning, terrifying certainty that this was only the beginning. My father was the first to recover, falling back on a lifetime of paternal authority. His voice, no longer weak, boomed in the quiet room. "That is a violation of my privacy. How dare you access my personal records?" Catherine answered before I could, her tone placid and dangerous. "Mr. Grant, when you filed a lawsuit claiming medical incapacitation and petitioning the court to liquidate your daughter's assets for your care, you made your health a matter of public record. We simply gathered the evidence you yourself made relevant." My mother, seeing the medical lie was unsalvageable, quickly pivoted. "Fine," she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "So Arthur is not dying. It does not change the fact that we are in financial trouble. After everything we did for you, is it too much to ask for help when we need it most? You have so much, Amelia. We just need to get back on our feet." I looked at her, my expression unreadable. "Is that what this is about? Getting back on your feet?" I let the question hang in the air, then I pushed the second, much thicker report across the table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "What is this now?" Tiffany asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "That I said my gaze locked on my father is the independent audit of the hospital's charitable foundation. It is a fascinating read. It details a very sophisticated system of embezzlement, totaling $850,000 over the last 4 years. It seems someone has been bleeding the oncology wing dry." I watched as my father's face went from pale to ashen. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a gesture of shock that was for the first time completely genuine. The report, I continued, my voice cold and precise, traces every single dollar. It all went through a series of shell corporations. Lakeside Strategic Solutions was one of them. "And it appears, Dad, that your signature is on every single bank account. So let me ask you again. Is the $1.2 million you are demanding from me really to help you get back on your feet?" Or is it to fill the massive hole you created before the hospital's annual audit brings your entire scheme crashing down? The carefully constructed world of my family imploded in that moment. The righteous anger, the feigned victimhood, it all evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal fear of exposure. My mother began to sob, not for her husband's health, but for their impending ruin. My father just stared at the report, defeated, a common thief caught in the act. The mask was not just off. It had been shattered. In the crushing silence that followed my accusation, a new character entered their family drama. Their lawyer, a man who had sat silently up to this point, cleared his throat. He was clearly out of his depth, hired to handle what he thought was a simple family dispute, not felony fraud. "Dr. Grant," he began, his voice strained. "These are very serious allegations. The audit you present it is an independent finding. We would need to conduct our own review. You have no definitive proof connecting these discrepancies directly to my client's intent." He was grasping at straws, trying to create a sliver of reasonable doubt where none existed. Catherine leaned back in her chair, a faint, predatory smile on her lips. She let him finish his weak defense, giving him just enough rope. "Are you suggesting, counselor, that Mr. Grant was perhaps unaware that he was the sole signatory on a dozen shell corporations, or that the $850,000 just accidentally fell into his accounts?" "He is an old man," Tiffany suddenly shrieked, finding her voice. "He gets confused. You are twisting everything to make him look like a monster." My father, seizing on this new narrative, immediately adopted a look of bewildered innocence. "I did not understand all the paperwork," he mumbled. "They told me it was for investments, for the family." It was a pathetic last-ditch effort to play the victim, but Catherine had anticipated it. "That is a fascinating defense," she said, her voice dripping with mock sincerity. She glanced towards the conference room door. "In that case, perhaps our final guest can help clear up any confusion." On cue, the door opened. David Chin, the young accountant from the foundation, walked in. He was dressed in a simple, neat suit, and he held a thick, leather-bound ledger in his hands. He looked nervous, but his eyes were steady and determined. My family stared at him as if he were a ghost. They knew exactly who he was. He was the quiet, unassuming man in the background of their board meetings, the one they had likely never given a second thought. David did not look at them. He walked to the table and placed the ledger in front of Catherine. "This is the Foundation's original handwritten cash flow ledger for the past 5 years," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I kept a separate physical copy of all transactions as per my own personal protocol. It details every withdrawal, every transfer, and most importantly, the authorization notes in the margins, many of which are in Mr. Grant's own handwriting. I am prepared to testify to the authenticity of this ledger in a court of law." The sight of the physical book, the undeniable proof of their deliberate long-term deception, was the final blow. It was one thing to argue against a digital report. It was another thing entirely to argue against your own signature written in ink next to a stolen sum of money. The last shred of their deniability vanished. They were cornered, exposed, and utterly defeated. The air in the room was so thick with despair it felt hard to breathe. My father stared at the ledger on the table, his face a gray, slack mask. My mother was weeping openly now, not the performative sobs of the gala, but the jagged, hopeless cries of true ruin. It was Tiffany in a final, desperate explosion of entitlement who sealed their fate. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, her voice cracking, her wild eyes fixed on me. "Even if everything you say is true, we are still family. The trust. Dad said the trust was for us. The house is still ours. We are beneficiaries. Whatever happens, you still have to take care of us." Her outburst was a raw display of the belief system they had operated under their entire lives, that they were owed my success, that my resources were theirs to claim regardless of their own actions. It was the last card she had to play, and she slammed it on the table with a sense of righteous certainty. I did not respond. I simply gave a small nod to Catherine. Catherine leaned forward, her voice calm and devastatingly final. She addressed Tiffany, but her words were for all of them. "You are correct, Tiffany. You were named as beneficiaries in the Grant Family Irrevocable Trust. She paused, letting a sliver of false hope hang in the air before she extinguished it completely. However, you seem to have overlooked a specific provision. Catherine picked up a single sheet of paper from a folder in front of her. She did not need to read it. She knew it by heart. I have it here if you would like to see. Clause 4, Section B. It states, and I quote, "The beneficiary rights of any listed member shall be permanently and irrevocably terminated should said member engage in a criminal act or a malicious act of public defamation that results in material or reputational harm to the trust's creator." She placed the paper down gently. Embezzling $850,000 from your daughter's charitable foundation certainly qualifies as a criminal act. And orchestrating a public campaign to destroy her reputation in a blatant attempt to cover up that crime, well, I think that more than covers malicious defamation. She looked at each of them in turn, her expression devoid of pity. So, to answer your question, Tiffany, no, she does not have to take care of you. As of this moment, you are no longer beneficiaries. You are entitled to nothing. The trust, the house, everything is hers alone. That was it, the final, elegant, inescapable checkmate. It was not just a legal victory, it was a moral one. The very shield I had built to protect myself 10 years ago had just become the sword that severed them from my life completely and forever. The finality of Catherine's words sucked all the remaining air out of the room. There was no more screaming, no more crying, no more pathetic justifications. There was only the dead, heavy silence of absolute defeat. My family sat frozen, trapped in the wreckage of their own making. Their lawyer, looking pale and utterly overwhelmed, slowly began packing his briefcase, the quiet clicks of the latches echoing in the stillness. He knew the fight was over. There was nothing left to say. Catherine stood up, her movements crisp and efficient. "My work here is done," she said, addressing no one in particular. She gathered her papers, gave me a brief approving nod, and walked out of the conference room, leaving me alone with them for the last time. I rose from my chair. I looked at the three people who had shared my name and my history. I saw my father no longer a patriarch, but a broken old man staring blankly at the glass table. I saw my mother, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, futile sobs. And I saw Tiffany, her face a mask of disbelief, as if she still could not comprehend a world that did not bend to her will. I felt nothing. Not pity, not anger, not even the lingering ache of sadness. The years of emotional turmoil had been cauterized, leaving behind only the clean, sterile emptiness of a successful excision. They were strangers to me now, architects of a betrayal so profound it had severed every bond we ever shared. I turned to leave my footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished floor. As I reached the door, I paused, my hand on the handle. I did not turn around. The lawsuit, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying across the room. I expect it to be withdrawn by the end of the day. I could feel their eyes on my back, but no one responded. I opened the door and stepped out into the reception area. Catherine was waiting for me, along with two other individuals. They were dressed in conservative suits, their expressions neutral and professional. They stood as I approached. I recognized them instantly from the news. They were economic crimes investigators from the Chicago PD. Catherine made the introductions, her voice low. "Amelia, these are Detectives Miller and Chen. They were very interested in the audit report we forwarded to their office this morning." I nodded to the detectives. "Thank you for coming," I said simply. "They are just waiting for Mr. Grant and his family," Catherine added, "to ask them a few questions downtown." I looked back at the closed conference room door. Through the frosted glass, I could see their motionless silhouettes. The justice system which they had tried to weaponize against me was now waiting for them. The trap they had set for me had snapped shut on them instead. I did not wait to watch them be escorted out. I did not need to. My part in their story was over. For the first time in my life, I walked away from their chaos without looking back, without a single ounce of guilt, and stepped out into the clean, cold air of a future that was finally entirely my own. The story broke the next morning. It was not a quiet, buried article on the back page. It was the lead story in the business section of the Chicago Tribune. Foundation scandal rocks major hospital. Prominent surgeons' parents investigated for embezzlement. The headline was stark, brutal, and public. The article laid out the core facts with journalistic precision. The significant financial discrepancies in the hospital's charitable foundation, the ongoing police investigation, and the central involvement of Arthur and Helen Grant. It even mentioned the now withdrawn civil suit they had filed against me, framing it as a likely attempt to extort funds to cover their crimes. My name was mentioned only in my professional capacity, portraying me not as a participant in the drama, but as the unwitting host of a parasite. The public fallout was swift and merciless. The carefully constructed facade of respectability my parents had maintained for decades shattered overnight. They went from being members of the city's philanthropic community to pariahs. Their friends stopped returning their calls. They were asked to resign from the boards of the other charities they sat on. The social world they valued so highly turned its back on them completely. The legal consequences were just as severe. Faced with the mountain of evidence Catherine and I had provided, my father had little choice. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. In exchange for his plea and his age, the judge spared him prison time, but the sentence was a different kind of life sentence. He was given 5 years of probation and ordered to pay full restitution of the $850,000 he had stolen. To meet the court's order, they had to sell everything. The sprawling suburban house I grew up in, the one filled with photos of a happy family that never truly existed, went on the market. Their cars, their art, the country club membership, it was all liquidated. They ended up in a small rented condo in a town I had never heard of, their lives reduced from a grand performance to a quiet, anonymous existence. Tiffany, stripped of her inheritance and her parents' financial safety net, was hit the hardest. The life of leisurely lunches and boutique shopping she had always known vanished. Her husband's family, who had likely been told a very different story about her divorce, wanted nothing to do with the scandal. Without a college degree or any meaningful work experience, her options were limited. The last I heard from a distant cousin who called to awkwardly apologize Tiffany was working as a cashier at a high-end grocery store, the kind of place she used to shop at. There was a bitter, tragic irony in it all. In their desperate, greedy attempt to seize my home, they had lost their own. In trying to destroy my reputation to cover their crimes, they had exposed themselves to the world and paid the ultimate price. They were left with nothing but the ashes of the life they had set on fire themselves. While my former family's life was unraveling, mine was undergoing a quiet, deliberate reconstruction. The scandal had left a deep wound on the hospital's reputation, and I felt a profound responsibility to heal it. My first action was to call an emergency meeting with the entire hospital board. I walked into the same conference room where I had received the news about the Sterling Foundation's withdrawal. This time, however, I was not a victim of circumstance. I was in command. I stood before them and took full, unflinching ownership of the situation. I did not make excuses or deflect blame. I acknowledged the breach of trust that had happened under my family's name and outlined a clear, decisive plan to ensure it would never happen again. The plan was built on a foundation of absolute transparency. I proposed a complete overhaul of the charitable foundation's governance. We would create a new independent oversight committee composed of respected financial experts from outside the hospital's immediate circle. All financial records would be made publicly accessible through a portal on the hospital's website, and there would be a mandatory independent audit twice a year, not just once. My final proposal was met with a moment of surprised silence. I nominate David Chin to be the new financial director of the foundation, I announced. He is the one who at great personal and professional risk brought this issue to light. His integrity is beyond question, and his meticulousness is exactly what this foundation needs to regain the community's trust. The board, led by Mr. Davenport, voted unanimously to approve every single one of my proposals. In the aftermath of the crisis, they saw not a leader who had been compromised, but one who was capable of navigating the institution through its darkest hour with strength and integrity. My next call was to the Sterling Foundation. I did not ask for their money back. I simply updated them on the new protocols we were implementing. I explained the new structure, the commitment to transparency, and the appointment of David Chin. I finished by saying that I understood their decision and that my primary goal was to rebuild a foundation worthy of their trust in the future, whether they chose to be a part of it or not. 2 days later, I received a personal hand-delivered letter from the head of the Sterling Foundation. It was brief and to the point. Dr. Grant, it read, "Integrity is not the absence of problems, but the manner in which one confronts them. Your leadership in this difficult time has been exemplary. We would be honored to reinstate our pledge, and we will be doubling the amount." I held the letter in my hand, a quiet sense of victory washing over me. It was more than just $1 million. It was a validation. From the ashes of my family's betrayal, something stronger, cleaner, and more resilient was already beginning to grow. Winning the war was one thing. Navigating the peace was another challenge entirely. The public victory and professional vindication did not magically erase a lifetime of emotional scarring. The silence left by my birth family was vast, and at first it felt unnervingly empty. To fill it not with noise, but with genuine connection, I knew I needed help. I found a therapist, a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, who specialized in complex family trauma. In her quiet, sunlit office, I began the painstaking work of unpacking the invisible baggage I had carried for decades. I learned to identify the subtle patterns of manipulation I had once accepted as normal. I grieved for the parents I wished I had not the ones I actually did, and I finally gave myself permission to stop feeling responsible for their choices. It was in one of those sessions that Dr. Sharma said something that resonated deeply. "You have spent your life being a surgeon for others," she told me. "Perhaps it is time to perform a little surgery on your own life. Identify what is healthy and build on it. Identify what is toxic and remove it. The choice is entirely yours." I took her words to heart. My house on the lake, once the fortress I had to defend, slowly transformed into a place of genuine healing. I started hosting small gatherings, not out of obligation, but out of a desire for connection. My guest list was not dictated by bloodlines, but by bonds of trust and mutual respect. Catherine, my formidable lawyer, became a regular, revealing a surprisingly sharp sense of humor once she was outside of a courtroom. David Chin, the foundation's new director, and his wife became close friends, our shared experience forging a bond stronger than years of casual acquaintance. Even Mr. Davenport, the hospital's president, and his wife would join us for barbecues by the water, our relationship evolving from professional to personal. This was my new circle, my chosen family. These were people who celebrated my successes without a hint of jealousy. They listened to my struggles without trying to exploit my vulnerabilities. They were individuals who added to my life rather than constantly trying to subtract from it. With them, I was not the designated savior or the family ATM. I was just Amelia. One warm Saturday afternoon, we were all gathered on my deck. The grill was smoking, music was playing softly, and the sound of easy laughter mingled with the gentle lapping of the lake. Catherine raised her glass of iced tea. A toast, she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "To Amelia, for teaching us all that sometimes the most important thing you can build is a strong fence." We all clinked glasses. And as I looked around at the faces of these people, these sturdy, kind, honorable people, I felt a sense of belonging that was deeper and more authentic than anything I had ever known. The silence in my life was no longer empty. It was filled with peace. 1 year later, I stood on the same stage in the same grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel under the same warm spotlights. It was the night of the annual charity gala. From the outside, the scene was identical to the one that had started this entire ordeal. But on the inside, everything had changed. This time there was no anxiety, no knot of apprehension in my stomach. There was only a profound sense of peace. The teleprompter in front of me showed the final fundraising tally for the newly restructured foundation. We had not just met our goal, we had shattered it, setting a new record for philanthropic giving in the city's medical community. My eyes scanned the crowd and found the front table. It was not empty. It was filled with my chosen family. Catherine was there looking as formidable as ever in a black evening gown. David Chin and his wife sat beside her, beaming with pride. Mr. Davenport was there raising his glass to me in a silent toast. These were the people who had stood by me, who had believed in me, and who were now celebrating this victory as their own. When it was my time to speak, I walked to the podium. I did not talk about betrayal or hardship. I spoke of resilience, of community, and of the true meaning of generosity. This past year, I told the room my voice clear and steady has taught me a valuable lesson. I learned that true generosity is not about limitless sacrifice. It is not about setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. It is about building strong boundaries so that what you give is healthy, sustainable, and truly makes a difference. You cannot pour from an empty cup. I ended my speech, and the applause that followed was not polite or scattered. It was a genuine thunderous roar of support. As I stepped down from the stage and walked toward my friends, I felt a quiet, unshakable sense of completeness. I had not just rebuilt my legacy, I had redefined it on my own terms. The house on the lake was still my sanctuary, but I no longer needed it as a fortress. I was home, not just in a place, but within myself. My story had a clear resolution, but I know that for so many people, these situations are ongoing and far more complicated. So, I want to ask you, have you ever had to draw a difficult boundary to protect your own peace? What did you learn from that experience? Let us know in the comments below so we can all learn from each other and build a community of support right here. And if this story resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who might need to hear this message, and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you for listening. And please remember, protecting your well-being is not selfish. It is essential. You are worth protecting.